Okay, I'm going to start because the first few things people can catch up with anyway. So for anyone who doesn't know me already, my name is Claire and I'm one of the TAs at Launch School. I'm also a student just over halfway through the Ruby track, although I have been saying that for a while now. Before we get started, I actually wanted to give a quick plug for the Launch School women's group. So there's a Slack channel for this group open to all women in the prep courses and beyond. We meet every 3 weeks. Our next meeting is not this Sunday, the Sunday after. We'll be doing a Q&A with students in the front end curriculum, including myself. So if you fancy joining in, all the details are in the Slack channel, the LS Women's group, or you can find the meeting in the calendar event, in the events calendar on Launch School's website. Okay, that's enough for that plug. This is the second in a series of introductory workshops for Ruby. Concurrently, we're running workshops on JavaScript and miscellaneous topics, which are covering study tips, command line, Git, etc. Now, don't worry if you weren't here for the previous workshop. These sessions are standalone, so you'll be able to follow along. These Ruby workshops are designed to complement Launch School's programming, a back-end prep Ruby course, and as introductory sessions, they'll give you a flavour for Launch School. They're not a substitute for going through the course materials, but hopefully they're a good complementary resource that will make learning feel less lonely. Let's have a look at what we will be covering today. So contents for today. So we're going to be looking at what is a method. We're going to look at parameters and arguments, what the difference is between them, method returns, method definitions and local variable scope, methods and blocks, and then blocks and local variable scope. If you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, because I might not see them in the chat. It can get busy. The chat is a good place for you to talk to each other, but not such a great place to talk to me. And I'll try to answer the questions as we go along, because I don't want to leave anyone behind. This is a safe space to learn and ask questions. If you're thinking it, the chances are that somebody else is thinking it too. There'll be time at the end for further questions. And I'll also post a link to a feedback form. Now I'm going to post that now. So anyone that needs to hop off early, you can grab that feedback form and fill it in at your leisure. We really appreciate people filling in this form. It gives us an idea of how these workshops are going, how we can improve them, and what things are working well and we should keep doing. One of the things people have suggested is to post code in the chat. So I'm going to try that today. Let's see how that works. Any feedback on how well that's working would be really appreciated. So if you want to code along with me, then please go ahead. Don't worry if it doesn't work for you, because I'll be using multiple choice quizzes to keep things interactive, which they're just for fun. No one's keeping records. They're anonymous. No one else will be able to see your scores or your answers or anything. I'll be working in AWS Cloud9, which you can see on the left of the screen. This provides a website where you can program, and we recommend Cloud9 because it's easier for us to support when people are all on the same system. And it's a fairly beginner-friendly environment to start with. But if you have your own environment that you prefer, then it's fine to use that one as well. Everything will work just the same. So let's begin. Let's have a look at what is a method. So methods are reusable chunks of code. They're helpful when you have functionality that you want to repeat over and over again. It saves you from copying and pasting the code all over the program. And that makes code easier to maintain, because if you want to update it, you only need to change it in one place. And method names can act as labels for bits of functionality, and that makes programs significantly easier to read and understand, because you can see the intention of a piece of code. So when you're reading other people's code, or when you're coming back to read your own code, by using methods and containing functionality in small chunks and labeling them clearly, you'll be able to remember why you wrote that method and what you were trying to achieve with those few lines of code. So it's really important. And naming of things is really important. It's not just clever code, but it's also important for other people to be able to follow what you're doing. Now, methods can be thought of as a set of instructions or a recipe, if you like, So today we're going to create a method for making a delicious pasta sauce. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to create a file to put this recipe into. So I'm going to do that using the command touch to create the file. I'm going to call it recipe, and the file extension is RB because it's a Ruby file. So I'm doing touch recipe.rb. Then if I have a look in the file tree here, I can see this is the file that I just created. So I'll double click that to open it up. And then here's where I can write my code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the code. Let's see how this works. Right, I've pasted that into the chat. So if you are coding along, you can copy that. And I'm just going to post it in here. So we are using the put s method followed by a string. So you've got put s and then strings. So and put s just outputs to the terminal, which we'll see in a minute. And you can see here that I've got chop onions and then pick up wooden spoon, stir pan with wooden spoon. These are the 2 lines that are repeated like 3 times. So you can see that's quite time consuming to have written all of that out. So if we save this file and then go back to the terminal, I'm going to type clear. It doesn't like that I've zoomed into this so much, so my command line prompt can get a little bit confusing. So I'll just clear my screen a lot. Now to run that file, you type Ruby and then you do the name of the file. So we're doing Ruby recipe.rb and then we just press enter to run it. And you can see that this is output all of the lines that we had in that file. Now, because we can see that there are these lines repeated 3 times, we can demonstrate how we can extract the repeated code into a method to reduce the amount of duplication we've got going on. So I'm just going to add a few empty lines at the top here. And I'm going to start with the keyword def, and that's what you use to begin a method definition. Then you have the name of the method, which I said is important to make it something descriptive. And then the end keyword finishes the method definition. So it begins with def and it finishes with end. And then in the middle of that is where you put the code that you want to be executed every time you run your method. So I'm going to copy these 2 lines here and paste them in. And so that means instead of these 2 lines, I can type the name of my method. And in Ruby, that's all you need, just the name of the method invokes the method. You don't even need any brackets after it or anything. So there we go. So I've replaced those 2 lines 3 times with the name of the method. I will copy out this code and paste it in again. We don't need that extra line there. So I'm going to save this and now I'm going to run it and then I'll talk through what's going on. So if I just press the up arrow, I get back the previous command that I ran. And you can see I'm outputting exactly what I did before, but in code that's a bit easier to understand and certainly easier to maintain and make changes to. So just to go over, def begins the method definition, end finishes it. We've got the name of the method there, stir pan, and then the code in the middle that is executed every time we call it. And then on lines 7, 9, and 11, that's where we are calling or invoking, either word is fine, the method. Now, let's explore another advantage that creating a method provides. So we've seen that this is good because I didn't have to keep writing out those 2 lines. But what about if we wanted to make a change to our recipe and we wanted to add something, an extra line here? So I'll paste that into the chat as well. Rather than having to add that line every time we wanted it, we can just add it once to the stir pan method, and now it will output 3 times when we call the method. So I'm going to clear the screen with the up arrow to get recipe back. You can see here that remove line, even though I only added it in one place, is now output in 3 places. So we can see just by adding one put-as statement to the method, we've changed the output in 3 places. Now we've learned how to create methods. We've demonstrated why they're useful. So let's have a quick quiz to recap. And remember, this is just for fun. Nobody's recording the results or anything. So I should come off of this so that you can't see the answers. And I'm going to launch the poll. So you give that a go. And then we will go through the answers once you've finished. I'll just give it a few minutes. Okay, if there's anyone who needs a little bit longer, can you put something in the chat so I can see? There's only a couple of people, and sometimes people are on devices that means they can't take part in the quizzes. Okay, I'm just going to stop it here, but if anyone would like a bit more time in the quizzes, put something in the Q&A and I'll definitely notice. So let's end that poll and I will share the results. And now we can go through the answers. So what are the purposes of creating methods? Yep, it's all 3. It makes code easier to read. It reduces duplication of code. It makes it dry, do not repeat yourself, and make code easier to change. The key word that's used at the beginning of a method definition is def, and a method named start process is invoked just with the method name start process. You don't need invoke. It's just the name of the method in Ruby will invoke it. Excellent. Right, so now we've learned about methods. Let's look at how to pass information into them. So parameters and arguments. So parameters and arguments work together to pass information into a method. Parameters are used in the method definitions and arguments are used in the method invocations. So going back to our example that we've got on the left-hand side, suppose we want to vary the way in which we stir the pan. So to see this in action, we're just going to update the method definition to include a parameter. So after the name of the method, then in round brackets, you can put parameters. So I'm going to put one in called stir style. And then in the middle string, I'm going to use string interpolation. And string interpolation is just when you insert a variable inside a string, and you do that using the hash symbol and curly brackets, and then the name of the variable you want to include, and you need to spell it properly like that. Let's widen that a little bit. Yeah, so that's all you need to do is just put the name of the variable that you want to pop inside the string, just inside these curly brackets, and that's called string interpolation. So I've included a parameter, and then I've put that parameter inside one of my statements there. And then when I invoke it, I need to pass an argument. So I'm going to create a local variable. So I just type the name of the local variable. I'm going to call it speed. And then the equal sign assigns that variable to a value. So I'm going to say speed is assigned to the string slowly. And then when I call or invoke the method, I need to pass that variable in as an argument, like that. Let me just copy that and paste it into the chat. Anyone that would like to copy it out? So Let's just have a quick look at the syntax again. When defining the method, after the method name, we've put the parameter name, which I've then used here inside the code that we want to execute. And then on line 7, I've created a local variable called speed. I've assigned it to the string slowly. And then I've passed that local variable speed as an argument each time I have invoked the method on lines 10, 12, and 14. So if we now save that file and then run it, so let's clear the screen again, go up, and here we can see that slowly word has been added in each of the 3 times that the method has been invoked. And so that's how, didn't mean to close it, that's how you can pass information into a method. Now you don't, it's going back to it. Notice that you don't have to create this variable here before the method definition. You only need to create the local variable before you use it in your invocation, before you call the method using it. It doesn't have to be defined before the method definition, but it does need to be defined before you pass it as an argument. And you can also, you've seen here that I've used a different name for the local variable outside and the parameter inside. That's just to show you that you can use different names for those, which sometimes is convenient to do. And here it's clear because now you can see that they are different things, but you can give them the same names because that might be useful for remembering what is being passed where. So you might want to use speed inside the method as well, but just to show you that you don't have to do that, you can use different names. And then I also, no, I'm not going to show that. I'm going to give you another quiz. So can you see? No, you can't. So I'm just going to have to make this a bit smaller to squeeze it all on the page just a little bit more. There we go. If anyone can't see that, let me know and I'll think what to do. Okay, so this is another poll I'm going to start now. Some of the questions in here are not things that I have covered explicitly, but it will just get you all thinking and I'm going to explain afterwards. So don't worry if you're not sure. It's not that you've missed anything. It's just a good way to get everyone thinking and taking part. So have a go at that. Okay, I'll just give you another 30 seconds or so because there were quite a few questions there, and it is tricky reading these code snippets off a screen and trying to answer questions on them. So I'll just give you a bit longer. Okay, is there anyone who would like a bit longer? Put something in the chat. No, okay, so I'm going to finish it there. And let's have a look at the answers. Sorry, I've only just seen the comment that you can't see questions 5 and 6. Questions 5 and 6 don't have code snippets. They were just the questions that were in the poll. So we'll go through it, so you'll see. Right, so I'll make this a little bit bigger again. So example 1, this is demonstrating using a value as an argument rather than using a local variable as we did here. So you don't have to, we could just pass in quickly inside here. And that would work as well. It would place quickly inside this string instead. So the answer for this one is it will output. There are around 700 separate programming languages, and thank goodness we don't need to learn all of them, eh? So example 2. This is demonstrating using multiple parameters and arguments. So when you use more than one argument, you separate them by a comma, but you put them all inside the round brackets, and then you do the same when you're defining the method and you're putting the parameters in, multiple of them. They're just comma delimited. So this one will output Alan Turing cracked the first Enigma machine. Then question 3. This demonstrates that an error is raised. So if a method is expecting a parameter, is expecting an argument, which you can see because there's a parameter defined, and you call that method without passing an argument, Ruby will raise an error. So if it's expecting you to pass an argument, you do have to pass an argument unless, which the second example, which the fourth example shows you, unless you define a default value. So when you define your method, if when you provide the parameter name, you put equals and then a value after it, when you invoke the method, if you don't pass an argument, Ruby won't raise an error. It will use the default that you provide instead. If you don't want to use that default, then you just invoke the method as you would usually and pass an argument in, and whatever you pass in will overwrite the default value here. So in this case, we didn't pass an argument in, so it will output Ada Lovelace was the world's first computer programmer. Then the last 2 questions, that's just to remind you of terminology. Arguments are used in method invocations, and parameters are used in method definitions. And after a while, you get used to the language with this, but it's important to know the difference so that you can communicate with other people and people know what you're talking about. So we have now looked at method definitions, and we've looked at how to pass the information into methods. And now we're going to have a look at how to get should I answer that question? I think I'm going to go back and answer that question. So the question is, if you try to run put s words outside of the method, it won't return that text. Yes, that's correct. And I am going to come on to variable scope towards the end. So I think I will answer that in more detail then, hopefully. Right, sorry. So we've passed information in. We're now going to get information out of methods. So first of all, I just wanted to do a quick reminder of the difference between output and return. So I'm going to type IRB, and this gets us into an interactive Ruby environment. So I don't need to create a file and run the file. Here I can just type Ruby code and it just executes it. So I've just done 1 + 2 and the hash rocket after it, so the equals and greater than sign, tells us what this line of code, what this expression returned. So it returned 3, no surprise there. It hasn't output anything. So if we put something like Ruby is the best, don't tell people on the JavaScript track, but Ruby is the best. We can see here, so we've used the put s method here, and that outputs something. So it's output this line here, Ruby is the best. And then the hash rocket afterwards tells us what this expression returns. Now put s, it doesn't matter what you pass into it, it always returns nil. It will output the string that you pass to it, but it will always return nil. So it's important there to understand that there's a difference between what an expression or method will output and what it will return. And previously, all the methods we've looked at, well, that method we've looked at and we've been playing around with for recipe, it's provided an output using the put s method. And that's what we've been looking at on the screen. But now we're going to create a method that creates a useful return. So to exit out of this, you type exit. I'm going to clear the screen. Oops. Clear the screen again. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a method that takes an integer that represents the number of servings for our pasta sauce, and then it returns the number of tins of tomatoes that we need to use. So it's a complicated recipe. And so all we want to do is be able to put in how many people we're going to cook for. So I'm going to cook for 20 people, and I want it to tell me how many tins of tomatoes I need to use. So I'm going to call this new file serving. So I use the touch command to create that file. I look in the file tree, I can see here is where I've created it. And then I'm going to paste in the code for it, which I'm going to put in the chat for anyone who's coding along. So we can see here, I've created a method on lines 1 to 3. The method name is number of tins. Its parameter is number of servings. It takes in an integer, and then I've used the return keyword so that this method will return out something useful, and it will return out the number of servings divided by 2. So if I want to feed 20 people, I need to use 10 tins of tomatoes. Now lines 5 and 6, I'm just doing so that we can see what's going on. So line 5, I'm invoking the method number of tins that I've defined at the top, and I'm passing in the integer 6. And what I'm doing here is I've created a local variable called returned value that I'm assigning to the return of this, so that we can see it by doing put s returned value. Because we can't see returns, we can only see outputs in the command line. I have to store the return and then use put s so we can actually see what it is. But we are talking about returns here, even though it's going to output to the terminal. So if I just save that and then we run it. So I'll do Ruby servings.rb, and that gives us 3, which is what we'd expect. We passed in 6, and it divides 6 by 2 and returns that number, so it's returning 3. So this here is returning 3. It's assigned to return value, and then on line 6, I'm just outputting returned value, so it's 3. Now, this is demonstrating an explicit return because I've used the keyword return. Now, once Ruby executes a line containing return, nothing else in the method is executed. It comes out of the method and that's the end. Let's demonstrate what that means. So if I just put Ruby exits the method before getting here, you can see that Cloud9 helpfully puts a yellow triangle there saying to me, warning, statement not reached. And that's the point I'm making. So even though we've got this here, when I run the method, it doesn't get to it. It doesn't output that message because this return keyword prevents us getting there. So that's what you need to know about the explicit return, is it returns the value. So that's the value that you get when you run the method, but then it also kicks you out of the method such that nothing else is executed. Now, let's look at a implicit return. So I'm going to delete that line because we don't need this for this. So to create yeah, so someone has asked if I just replace that with put S number of tins, would it still work? Yes, it would. It would output 3. Maybe that would be a better way of explaining this. I'm going to take that as some feedback. Okay, right. So we're going to create an implicit return now. So let's remove that return keyword, and then I no longer need these parentheses anymore. And this is now a return. This is now an implicit return. So if I save that and then run it, we're still getting 3, even though I don't have the return method anymore. It's still returning 3, and that's called an implicit return. This is because in Ruby, this isn't true for all languages, but it's true for Ruby. If a method doesn't use the return keyword, the return value will be the value of the last expression evaluated by the method. Now, in this case, I've only got one line. So that is the last line of the method. And so it's the return of that line that is the implicit return of the method. If we want to create an explicit return, we use the return keyword and it will return that and then not execute any more code. And an implicit return, don't use the return keyword, and the method will return whatever the last expression was that was evaluated. So let's have a quick quiz on the returns of some different methods. So I can make this a bit bigger. Just got 3 code examples there. So method returns, have a go at this. Just give you another 30 seconds or so. Is there anyone who would like a bit more time? Are you all done? Right, I'm going to assume everyone's done. Let's have a look at the answers. Okay, so for the first one, this is demonstrating. No, this is the wrong set of answers. It's not demonstrating that. Here we go. Right, so this first one is demonstrating an explicit return. So this returns 3. Then example 2 is demonstrating an implicit return. So this is 2 times 4, so it's returning 8. And then the last one, we've got an explicit return here. And so this is demonstrating that that last line here isn't executed. And so it just returns Space War. And the first computer game, well, Space War isn't even output because this is not executed. So nil isn't returned, even though the last expression in this method is a put S invocation, and that would return nil because the return keyword is on the line before. It never gets to this line. So this method returns the variable that was passed in, which is Space War. Well done, everyone. So I gave you a quick preview there. We're doing method definitions and local variable scope now. So 1 and 2, why isn't the return nil? Aren't those outputs instead of returns? Sorry, I'm going to go back. I should pause a bit to just see if there are any questions. No, these aren't outputs. The question was asking return, and the return of the, okay, you've got it. So, and the return is the value of the expression that is passed into return, or the value of that, right? So method definitions and local variable scope. So firstly, what is variable scope? Variable scope refers to where a variable can be used. So for local variables, this is determined by where it was created or initialized. Let's look at this in action. So I'm now going to create another file, and we're going to call this one reviews. So touch reviews.rb to create that new file. Go in here, open it up. And then I'm going to paste in some code, which I'll paste in the chat as well. There we go. So we've created a local variable on the first line called verdict, and we've assigned it to the string 5*, lines 3 to 5. We've got a method definition, which outputs a string, this mill was, and then we want to pass into that the local variable verdict. And then on line 7 is where we're invoking that method. So if we just wrote a method without an invocation, nothing would happen. We need to actually invoke it to see what happens. We can see that Ruby, Cloud9 is telling us this local variable is assigned, but it's not used, which is a bit worrying because I think I'm using in here. So if I just save this, and then I'm going to run the file. So let's clear the screen and then run that file. We get an error. Now it's important to get used to errors. You'll be seeing a lot of them if you're anything like me. And they do provide useful information. So this has told me that the problem is on line 4 here. In review, it even gives me the name of the method that the problem has occurred in. And it says there's an undefined local variable or method called verdict. So Ruby doesn't know something is a local variable or a method, because as you can see, we just defined both. We're just saying the name. And so if it can't find it, it just says, well, all I know is that there isn't a local variable and there isn't a name that I can access called verdict. So what's going on? So the problem here is that method definitions create their own variable scope outside of the regular flow of execution. So this means that variables created or initialized is another way to refer to it. It's created or initialized outside of a method definition cannot be accessed inside the method definition. So inside here, verdict doesn't exist. Now we've already learned how to overcome this issue by using parameters and arguments. So if I pass verdict in as a parameter there and verdict in as the argument there, just copy that code and paste it in the chat, I can now run this method and it works. And that's why we have parameters and arguments, so that we can pass information into method definitions, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to pass information into them. Now, just as method definitions can't access local variables created outside, so if I just cut that from there and put this in here, I'm going to put this back to how it was before. If I now try to access that local variable that is created inside the method definition, but I'm trying to access it outside the method definition, we run that code, I get an error. So it manages to run the method fine, the method's working, but on line 9 in main, so I'm not inside a method definition here, I'm just inside the global scope, the main scope, there's an undefined local variable or method called verdict. So it's telling me on line 9 here, this verdict here is undefined in this main scope outside the method definitions. So to summarize, method definitions create their own variable scope such that local variables created in global scope in main outside here cannot be accessed inside here unless you pass them in with arguments and parameters. And any local variables created inside a method cannot be accessed outside the method in global scope. So let's have a quick quiz to make sure that we've got that. Just check. There's only 3 examples, yeah. So you see, you're not missing anything off the bottom there. What you can see there is what there is. So let's create method definitions and variable scope. So I've launched the next poll, give it a go. I'll give you another 30 seconds. Okay, let's have a look at the answers. Okay, so example 1. This one is demonstrating a local variable initialized in global scope, in the main scope, up on the first line. And then we're trying to access that inside the first virus method. We can't do that. Local variables initialized in global scope are unavailable inside method definitions. So for question 1, the answer is an error. For question 2, here we've created a local variable inside the method. So scientist is being assigned to the string Margaret Hamilton, and we're trying to access that local variable outside, but local variables initialized inside method definitions cannot be accessed outside method definitions, so that also raises an error. And then for the last example, this one is demonstrating how to correctly pass in information into method definitions. So we've created Pioneer, we've assigned it to Charles Babbage, and then we've passed that into the first programmable computer method. So now name will be pointing to Charles Babbage, and it will output name created. It will output Charles Babbage created the first programmable computer. So this will be executed. However, the question says, what will first programmable computer Pioneer return? And it will return nil, because put S always returns nil. I'm sorry, this wasn't meant to be a trick question. Put S always returns nil. So it doesn't matter what you pass to it, it returns nil. So whilst this does output Charles Babbage created the first programmable computer, it's correct. The question was asking what was returned, and so nil is returned from this method. Okay, so now we're going to move on to how variable scope is related to blocks. We've looked at variable scope in relation to method definitions, and variable scope with blocks is slightly different. So first of all, I just want to describe what a block is. So previously, we've passed information into methods using arguments. We can also pass information into methods using blocks. Now, block is just a piece of code. It comes after a method invocation. It's either inside curly braces or it's between keywords do and end. It's a lot like a method in that it's a chunk of code, but it doesn't have a name. Now, generally, curly braces are used if the block fits on one line, and do end if the block spans several lines, but otherwise we can just think of them as being the same thing. Let's create a new file, and I'm going to call this cleanup. So touch cleanup.rb. Let's go here and open the file, and I'm going to paste in the code. So I'll put it in the chat, and then I'll put it in here. So if you've not come across the times method, it's a really useful method. So you have an integer, and then you do a dot, and then the name of the method, so it's times. So we're invoking the times method on the integer 3. And the times method takes a block, and it executes that block the number of times that you specify by the integer that you're invoking it on. So it's probably easier to see what this does rather than explain it. So I've saved that file. Let's clear that, and then I'm going to run cleanup, so we can see that it outputs scrub pan 3 times, because that's what is in the block, and it does it 3 times. This is obviously using the curly brackets, so we can use do end instead. So I just cut that out of there, put it in there instead, and get rid of this erroneous curly bracket on the end. So this is just demonstrating a block using do end instead of curly brackets. In this way, it would output exactly what we did before, but let's demonstrate the purpose of this, which is that you can put several lines of code inside the block. You're not restricted to just one. So if we execute that, we can see those lines are executed 3 times. So it executes them once, twice, 3 times. Now that's a very short introduction to blocks. There's a lot more to them, But in essence, they are quite simple. Like I said, they're like methods. They're chunks of code. They're just not named, and they're passed into methods when we invoke methods. So now we want to have a look at what happens with variable scope in relation to blocks. And this is the last topic. Here we go. And this might be a little bit tricky if you've not come across it before, but the more often you're exposed to these things, the easier it is to understand this. So let's just go ahead. Now, the rule for blocks and variable scope is the inner scope can access variables initialized in outer scope, but not the other way round. So let's introduce a local variable into our method invocation with a block so we can see what happens with variable scope. So let's paste the code into chat so anyone coding along can see it. And then here, so I've got my 3 times still, my block defined with do and end. I've introduced a local variable called instruction, and I've assigned it to the string scrub pan. I'm then using put s to output scrub pan, and then put s to rinse pan. So this is actually exactly the same as it was before. I've just introduced a local variable so that we can see where that local variable can be accessed. So it's been defined inside the block, so it can be accessed inside the block, but it cannot be accessed outside the block. So if I use the put s method with that local variable instruction out here, I'll get an error. Let's demonstrate that. So it executed the code at the top because that was still fine. It was only when it got to line 7, it tells me that in my main scope, I've got an undefined local variable or method called instruction. So here, I cannot access the instruction that was defined inside the block. So outer scope cannot access inner scope, but the other way round, I move that up. If we move the local variable declaration, the local variable initialization, I create the local variable in global scope, so outside of the block, it can be accessed inside the block. It can obviously be accessed outside the block here because we created it outside the block. So I'm going to comment that out because we know that will work. But what might be interesting is that we can access this inside the block, even though the local variable was initialized outside the block. So you can see that ran. So local variables initialized outside a block can be accessed inside a block, but local variables created inside a block can't be accessed outside the block. And someone's just clarifying here that outer scope is also called main scope. Yes, and when you nest things, it might be outer scope in relation to something else, because you could imagine that I might put in here another 2 times do something. And I could put some lines of code here. I'm sorry, I feel because I'm learning JavaScript, I'm getting confused when I go between 2 languages. Right. So here we might describe this as being outer scope to this inner scope here. So outer scope can be the main global scope, but it might also be just the outer scope to an inner scope. Okay, so we're nearly at the hour point here. So I'm just going to do this last quiz. So give this a go. It is going to help you if I give you the code snippets. There we go, just 2 code snippets there. Give it a go. And for anyone that needs to leave early, I'm going to put the, well, leave early, leave on time. I'm going to post the feedback form. Okay, so I've put the feedback form in the chat for anyone that needs it. Might just give you another 20 seconds or so. Shout if you need more. Which I mean, just put something in capital letters in the chat because you all know that's shouting. Okay, everyone's participated. Wow. Okay, so let's share those results. Love keen quizzes. People who take part in my quizzes, I love. So let's have a look at the answers. So for the first example, number is being initialized inside the block here. And that means we cannot access it outside the block down here. So this will raise an error. Whereas the second example is demonstrating the local variable being initialized outside the block. It can be accessed inside the block. And that means not only can it be accessed, but it can be reassigned. So on the first line, number is assigned to the integer 5. And then in the do end block, number is reassigned to 3. And it's reassigned to 3 times. But it means that on that last line, number is pointing towards 3. So this will output 3 and not 5. These are not different local variables. They're the same local variable. They're both number, and inside the block it's being reassigned to 3. Once you've been coding with Ruby a lot, this does become second nature, but it did trip me up quite a lot to begin with because it's not the same as method definitions, where if you did this, you could have a local variable called number outside a method definition, and you could have a local variable number inside a method definition, and they are different local variables. Which is, someone's just asking that question, so hopefully I've just answered that. Right, so excellent. So let's go on to the summary. So this is what we've covered. That was quite a lot of information. So don't worry if you didn't follow all of it. Learning is a circular process. Each time you're exposed to a new topic, it becomes more familiar and meaningful. So now I'd like to give you a chance to answer questions. I also have one last quiz. Could you let me know in the chat whether you would like it or whether you're all quizzed out? But I'm happy to give the quiz if at least one person would like it. And if you've got any questions, then put them in the Q&A. It can be related to what we've done today. That would be good. You see, Jennifer, Abigail, Jake, brilliant. You all want the quiz. So let's do that. Here we go, round up quiz. So I'm going to launch that. There aren't any code snippets with this one. It's just theory questions. And I shall have a think about any questions that come in. Okay, I'll just give you another 20 seconds or so. So there were quite a few questions there. Anyone who thinks they're going to need more than that time, put something in the chat. I'll give you a bit longer. Okay, let's have a look at the answers there. Show the results. Look at the answers. Right. So what have we got here? Open something up so I can't see. Right. So what we've got here. So how is information passed into or used inside methods? I've had difficulty wording that question. So any any suggestions on how to ask this question such that people will give the answer? Arguments, parameters, and blocks. So what I'm trying to get across here is the arguments, parameters, and blocks are the things that are used to pass information into methods. And then question 2 is about how to get information out of methods. And so that answer is return values. Yeah, so in the feedback, any suggestions to how to word that question to make it a bit clearer, I'll be grateful for. Question 3, method definition and local variable scope. So the statement is method definitions can access local variables initialized outside of the method definition. That's false. Method definitions cannot access local variables initialized outside of the method definition. And then the question 4 is the same thing, but local variables initialized inside method definitions can be accessed outside method definitions. Again, that's false. So anything any local variables defined inside a method definition cannot be accessed outside, and any local variables initialized outside the method definition cannot be accessed inside the method definition. It's only by passing arguments and using parameters that you can access the values that variables are assigned to, but you don't access the actual variable itself, only the object that it's pointing to. I've veered a bit into that. All of that is explained in the Ruby course. And the last 2 questions are looking at blocks and local variable scope. So inner scope can access local variables initialized in outer scope, but that's true. But the last one is false. Outer scope can access local variables initialized in inner scope. That's false. So inner scope can access outer scope, but outer scope cannot access inner scope. So, okay, like I say, if these are things that you're not yet comfortable with, there's lots of exercise in Launch School's Ruby course. And by the end of it, you will be comfortable with all of this and it will become second nature. But it is quite a lot of information to take on board in 1 hour. So can I go over the trick question again? Yes, okay, I'll go back to that, Jake. So I'm going to go on to what we're doing next time. So we looked at methods and variable scope today. Next time, we're going to look at flow control and loops. So at the moment, we've just been using code that just runs top to bottom, using flow control. We can change the path of a program such that it doesn't always execute lines of code, and such that we can change the order in which code is executed. And actually, the times method that I've put here is a type of a loop. So here we didn't just execute code from top to bottom. We went from top to bottom, then back round again 3 times. So we've already looked at this a little bit more. A little bit here, but we'll look at that more next week. And I mean, I'm sure this workshop was fun, but I do think that working with if blocks and case statements and loop methods and stuff is a little bit more fun. So hopefully, if you've enjoyed today's workshop, I will see you all next week. I'm going to just put in the feedback form again if you haven't got the hint. please fill it in. I'll be really grateful. And now I'm going to answer a couple of questions that have come in. So we don't need this anymore. Right, so the first question was about method, how to find out what methods there are and whether like times is a method name. So if you go to the website, which I'll paste in the chat, so ruby.org, there what you're looking for, the complete API docs for Ruby. These generally say the same things. There are differences between the different versions because there are methods that stop being supported and there are new methods that come in. But generally, I'd expect you to be using methods that have been there for a while and continue to be in there. So if I just click on any of these, I clicked on this one. So I'm looking at version 2.7.7, but the times method will be in all of them. On the left-hand side, we've got the pages. This is a bit confusing. Well, it was confusing to me when I first looked at it. There's a lot of information there that you just don't need at this point. But if you scroll down, you can see class and module index. And so what we're looking for here is integer, because we're calling the times method on an integer. So if we want to see all of the methods that can be invoked on integers, we go to the integer class. It tells us about the integer class. And then on the left-hand side, we've got methods. So we've got methods that you would expect, like adding things, subtracting things, less than. And then we've also got the times method there. And so here, this is telling us what it does. It iterates the given block int times, passing in values from 0 to int -1. Okay, because it starts from 0, it doesn't start from 1. So if you pass 3, it does 0, 1, 2, because it does it 3 times. Again, you know, these explanations are not always the easiest to understand, but the more you look at the Ruby docs, the more you kind of learn the language and you understand what they're explaining. Now, the last one is that accidental trick question. Let's see if I can find it. The one that returned nil. It's this one. So, got a method definition. It's defining the method first programmable computer, which takes a parameter name, and then it uses the put s method. So it will output the string that's passed in there, interpolating the parameter name. Outside, we've created a local variable called Pioneer. We've assigned it to the string Charles Babbage. We're then invoking the method, and we're passing Pioneer in. So that is pointing to Charles Babbage. So name is pointing to Charles Babbage. So put S, Charles Babbage created the first programmable computer is output. But the question didn't ask what was output. The question asked what was returned. And the put S method, doesn't matter what you pass to it, it always returns nil. And because that's the last expression evaluated, it's the only expression evaluated by this method, but it's the last line evaluated by the method, the return of this line is what is returned by the method, and put S returns nil, so this method returns nil. Someone has asked, should we use Ruby version 3 instead of 2? It seems I still have version 2 installed. You shouldn't hit any problems using version 2. As you progress through the course, you might be advised to start using a later version when you start integrating with other applications and things, but it's clearly signposted in the course materials. So when you're at the beginning of the course, it really doesn't matter what version of Ruby you're using, because the things that you're using are things that have been there for a long time. And it's only when you start integrating with databases and trying to deploy stuff on the internet that it begins to matter. And that is moving on all the time, because new versions of Ruby are being released all the time. So depending on when you get to that point depends on which version you should be running then. But it's not something you need to worry about in these early stages. And when you do need to worry about it, Launch School will tell you what you need to do. Now, right. So I think I've answered all the questions and I've given you the feedback form. I've had lots of thank yous, so that's really nice. So if nobody else has got any questions, I will hang around for people to grab that feedback form, which I'll just paste in again, just in case it's got lost in the chat. And hopefully I will see lots of you next week. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for taking part. You're all really keen quizzes. I was really impressed. So thank you very much. And you also have some great questions. So I hope that's helped everybody answering those questions. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.